Welcome back, focused learners. Let's just jump right into it today. We are unpacking a genuinely fascinating and, frankly, highly provocative piece of source material. We're looking at a deeply personal, ground-level analysis written back in 2007. The content comes directly from the founder of Life Chen Yuan, Feng. He was actually right there, observing a catastrophic economic crisis unfolding in real time in Zimbabwe. And what's so interesting is that from that specific tragedy, he extrapolated these incredibly radical utopian philosophies about how our entire world should be governed. So we're going to explore the stark facts he recorded, and then we'll dive into the rather controversial conclusions he drew from them.
To guide our journey today, we're essentially going to use a funnel approach. We'll start ground level with A Paradise Lost, checking out the actual economic reality. Then we'll narrow in on the three root causes and the Mugabe dilemma. And finally, we'll zoom way out to his broader ideas on rethinking sovereignty and what he calls a humanitarian global vision.
Okay, I want to start you off with a quick thought experiment based on Feng's direct first-hand experience. Just picture yourself walking down a street in the capital city of Harare. It's the year 2007. You reach into your pocket and you pull out 1 million local Zimbabwe dollars. Just pause for a second and really think about what a number that massive, a literal $1 million, could buy you.
Well, the scale of the economic devastation here is literally hard to wrap your head around. Feng points out that just a decade prior, back in 1997, that same $1 million could have bought you a luxury villa right in the capital. But by 2007, that exact same stack of cash couldn't even buy a single cigarette. On the black market, it took 1 million Zimbabwe dollars to get just $1 US. I mean, that is hyperinflation in its purest, most devastating form, and it's exactly the shock that sparked the author's 8 reflections.
Which brings us right to part 1, A Paradise Lost, the collapse of Africa's breadbasket. Let's look at how a nation with so much inherent promise fell so incredibly hard.
Feng noticed this incredibly heartbreaking paradox. On one hand, you have a nation with a perfect, mild climate year-round. In fact, he described it as arguably the best living environment on Earth. It's packed with massive mineral wealth and spectacular tourism resources. But at the exact same time, the supermarket shelves were completely bare. We're talking no flour, no cooking oil, no meat, not even basic stuff like matches or vinegar. He paints this really vivid picture, describing the country as a beggar holding a golden bowl, just starving while quite literally sitting on top of immense natural wealth.
And you know, the human toll of this paradox was just staggering. At the time when Feng was writing this, the reported unemployment rate had hit an unbelievable 80%. Imagine living in a society where 8 out of 10 adults have no formal work. And you combine that with the reality of constant rolling power and water outages in most residential areas, the absolute daily grind for basic survival had completely eclipsed what, barely a decade earlier, was known as a wealthy, clean, highly organized garden city.
And this wasn't just his personal, anecdotal observation. The global data completely backed up what he was seeing on the streets. The World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report for that period ranked Zimbabwe at 129 out of 131 countries surveyed. A nation that was once proudly known as the breadbasket of Africa had literally plummeted to the absolute bottom of the global barrel.
So how exactly does a collapse like that happen? Let's move into Section 2. 3 root causes: political bottlenecks.
In his analysis, the Life Chen Yuan founder distills the crisis down to 3 primary political decisions. First, a heavily flawed land reform policy that ended up paralyzing thousands of productive farms, which basically destroyed the country's agricultural backbone. Second, the decision to leave the Commonwealth, which resulted in severe international self-isolation. And third, the aggressive suppression of opposition parties. He argues that this stifled intellectual diversity and forced the state into a corner of really rigid, inflexible thinking.
Now, these bottlenecks didn't just happen in a vacuum, right? They all tied back to the very top of the political pyramid. And that takes us to Section 3, the Mugabe dilemma, the fear of stepping down.
By 2007, Feng points out that pretty much all of the nation's core issues centralized around one specific figure, President Robert Mugabe. He was 83 years old at the time and had held uninterrupted power for 27 years, ever since independence in 1980. Now, while he was originally seen by many as a massive national hero, by 2007, the public was desperate for him to step down. They saw his exit as the absolute only way forward. But rumors were swirling that he planned to hold on for another 5 years. The question was, Why?
Well, Xu proposes an answer in his fifth reflection, which we can call the leader protection theory. It's a fascinating concept. He argues that aging leaders like Mugabe, or even someone like Saddam Hussein, don't necessarily cling to power just out of sheer greed. They hold on because of absolute, paralyzing fear. They're terrified that the second they let go of the reins, opposition forces are going to execute them and go after their families. So, Xu suggests a pretty radical legal workaround: special international amnesty laws that guarantee total protection for former leaders. His logic is that if you remove that fear of retribution, you remove the political bottleneck, allowing for peaceful transitions and ultimately sparing the nation from years of drawn-out suffering.
And honestly, that idea of international amnesty, that's really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to his theories. Let's transition into Section 4, Rethinking Sovereignty, Radical Solutions. This is where he completely zooms out and offers some highly provocative, utopian prescriptions for the entire world.
To really grasp how big of a pivot he makes here, we have to look at this intensely controversial anecdote from his first reflection. Xu recounts a conversation he had with his local gardener. He asked him straight up whether life was better under British colonial rule or after independence. And the gardener replied that from a purely practical survival standpoint, British rule was actually better. Now, Xu readily acknowledges the brutal exploitation inherent in colonialism, but he uses this worker's perspective to posit a highly controversial idea: that sometimes early national liberation movements can actually cause a regression in basic living standards if the newly independent state completely fails to manage its own economy.
So he takes that observation and uses it to challenge our entire modern global system. Think about it. Today's world is built entirely on national sovereignty, non-interference, and the UN. But Xu radical vision argues that the very concept of the nation-state is the root cause of these humanitarian crises. He actually believes nation-states should be dissolved entirely. He thinks the rule of non-interference is totally obsolete. He uses this great metaphor, saying it's like having a neighbor who's making toxic noise all night. The whole neighborhood suffers, so the neighborhood has a right to intervene. He essentially calls for mandatory global intervention in failing states. He even suggests that if local leaders are running a country into the ground, international organizations should just bypass borders completely and install merit-based administrators from anywhere in the world to fix things. And as you might guess, he fiercely criticizes the UN for being too weak to actually prevent the suffering he was witnessing firsthand.
Okay, so dissolving borders, bypassing sovereignty, these are massive, aggressive, utopian arguments, but what's the ultimate goal behind them? That brings us to our final section: a humanitarian global vision, the ultimate priority.
For Xu all of these radical structural changes serve one unifying humanitarian purpose, which he lays out in his sixth and eighth reflections. We can call these his global imperatives. First up, international aid is not some generous, optional choice. It is a strict moral obligation. He argues that wealthy nations cannot be truly, authentically happy while ignoring the suffering of others. He actually calls that kind of joy a selfish madness. And second, all of our grand technological achievements mean absolutely nothing if people are still freezing and starving to death. For him, eradicating global hunger has to be the absolute prerequisite before we pat ourselves on the back for any other kind of progress.
Which leaves us with this final, deeply provocative thought pulled right from Xu writings. We send rovers to Mars, right? We build stealth jets. We launch thousands of satellites into orbit. But he asks, if people right here on Earth are still begging with empty bowls, is our technological advancement really a point of true civilized pride? Or is it merely, as he calls it, a wild boar's pride? It is a striking question, and it completely challenges the metrics we use to define what makes a successful human civilization. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into Xu reflections, Focus Learners. Until next time, keep questioning and keep learning.